This is Transcast from the Metrans Transportation Center. I'm Matt Kaplan. What happens at the intersection of transportation and society? That was the general topic of my conversation with Dr. Lisa Schweitzer of the University of Southern California. Lisa is an award-winning professor in USC's School of Policy Planning and Development. She conducts research that centers on transportation, urban environments, and social justice. Her work has been published in many planning and interdisciplinary journals. Lisa recently joined me from her office via the Internet. Lisa, thanks very much for joining us for this edition of the Metrans Transcast.
Happy to be here.
We're going to talk extensively, I hope, about your research, but I wonder if we could start with sort of a general question that may underlie a lot of it, and that is the relationship that you've been exploring for quite some time between transportation issues, and more broadly infrastructure, and social equity in society.
Okay, well, there's a lot of different things that we can talk about there. You know, the connections between social equity and transportation go back a long way, like most urban issues do. Even as far back as Plessy versus Ferguson, Mr. Plessy, I believe, had purchased a first-class ticket. He was an African-American man, and the railroad refused to honor it, and they tried to put him in a segregated car, which started us off on the sort of separate but equal doctrine that dominated American law for some time with regard to sort of how people were going to be treated in the public realm according to race. That transportation conflict, right, this idea that transportation is in some respects a public space, and it's also very key to individuals' economic opportunities, creates an enormous amount of possibility for either helping to integrate people within cities and within cultures, or on the opposite side, excluding them from opportunities and excluding them from cities.
That is so fascinating because, of course, Plessy versus Ferguson, I never thought of it as a transportation issue. I suppose, therefore, you could look at the right to get from one place to another via common public means of transportation as a basic right.
There are many people in the research in urban theory who talk about the right to mobility, the right to be able to get to places by virtue of relatively inexpensive, relatively accessible modes. So there's a big group of studying things like auto dependency in cities, right, or auto orientation in cities. Basically means that a person has to be able to purchase a car to be able to get to the majority of opportunities. And that purchase price of a car is prohibitive for some families. That in of itself starts to look like something that really inhibits people's rights to the city or capacities to be integrated into the city. And there are other people who look at that issue from another perspective and note essentially that cars really do provide a lot of opportunities, right? And that flexibility and the control that cars provide are something that are very essential to people who need to have good quality access.
So are there actually suggestions that the right to own and operate an automobile is something that should be protected by government?
No, the controversies that I'm talking about there really explores a gap, with one camp talking about, you know, what we really need to do is overcome auto dependency and really provide ubiquitous, good quality public transit so that impoverished people in cities or traditionally social excluded parts of cities are really integrated within the larger regional fabric. Then there's another group that essentially say, you know, our cities sort of are what they are. A lot of the data shows that cars provide a lot of utility for families, and that increasing access to automobiles helps impoverished families get a lot more access to opportunities than waiting for the public transit system to mature does. Mm-hmm. So it's a debate, but it kind of enlightens us about the real choices that metropolitan areas have to make in order to really enable people to get what they need in cities.
Now, I suppose I'm looking at this through the prism of someone born, raised, lived my whole life in the land of the automobile, Southern California. You and I are speaking now, probably 25, 30 miles apart between the Cal State Long Beach campus and USC. I could drive there, get on the 110, and barring traffic, which is a ridiculous statement nowadays, I could probably be up there in 20, 25 minutes. If I wanted to reach you via public transportation, I would be facing a much larger challenge and a much longer trip in most cases.
That's right. And that's the core. Some of this is the timing and how long it takes for public transit to blossom and to create good geographic coverage. There's a lot of research that talks about how it's less expensive in terms of out-of-pocket costs to take public transit, but it's a lot more expensive in terms of time. And I think it's a mistake to argue essentially that impoverished people or impoverished workers or impoverished family, that they don't need that time just as much as everybody else. And that's the question. I think this is a very interesting research question about, we are pursuing a lot of rail investment in Los Angeles. We've got a lot of public transit that is provided in Los Angeles. There are over 1 million boardings per day on the MTA alone, right? There are a lot of people using the transit, even though almost nobody thinks about public transit. Almost nobody thinks about public transit in Los Angeles in the same sentence, right? There's a lot of it going on, all of that notwithstanding. But those questions are essentially, can we really ask people to wait for transit to catch up with cars as a way of providing them access to jobs?
So if we look at the automobile as another solution to this problem of equity, then how in the world do we put more cars in, do we put it this way, how do we put more underprivileged, underserved families behind the wheels of their own cars? You don't see too many assistance programs for people to buy an automobile.
It's a tough call because cars are also really expensive to own. There's a bunch of really interesting programs cropping up around the United States that we should probably talk about. One is iGo car sharing out of a community organization that I work with called the Center for Neighborhood Technology in Chicago. iGo is a separate entity from the Center for Neighborhood Technology, but they're partners. And that is an attempt to enable people to have relatively inexpensive access to a car subscription program so that a person can sign up to use a car when they need it, but they don't have to have one all the time. One of the things that might be very crucial here, there's a researcher at the University of California, Los Angeles, named Evelyn Blumenberg, who discussed this idea with me one time where she described transport packaging, right? A lot of impoverished people or a lot of people without cars package their transportation across a whole bunch of different modes. So they're not just transit riders, they're not just walkers, they're not just taxi takers, they're not just car drivers, right? They sometimes, have access to a car, sometimes they don't, sometimes, they take the bus, sometimes they get a ride home after they've taken the bus home. People really do, when they need to, package their mobility across a whole variety of services. And that if we think about that as being a potential way of trying to overcome both the costs associated with cars and the time lags associated with transit, we might be able to do a better job of creating sort of multiple systems for people to be able to patronize depending on the context and depending on their time demands that day and a whole bunch of other things that make the whole system a little bit more responsive and cheaper for people to use. So, you see what I'm getting at there?
I certainly do, and I hope no one is suggesting that one end of the spectrum or the other is the only answer, that there is a need for some balance between public transportation systems and perhaps this somewhat more foreign concept of, the iGo system that you talked about, which oddly enough, in another life, I once did a radio interview with somebody representing them, and I remember when I finished the interview, the people outside the studio, more Southern Californians, of course, this was so foreign to them and not repugnant, but so odd to them that somebody would get out of a car and somebody else would then get into it and drive away.
Right. You think about somebody like me. I actually don't drive a car because I can barely run a stapler, but that's a different question. And that's a good thing. But, my husband and I live in an area with a whole bunch, we live downtown, so there's a whole bunch of different ways of getting around. And we have a car, but we use it primarily to take our dogs to the vet. And so if you were to think about it, and we have the car essentially because we paid it off 180 years ago, and there's no point in getting rid of it once you own it outright. But if you think about, we don't really need the car every single day. We don't, most of the time it just sits there. So there's no reason why it couldn't be doing what it does so well, right? Which is individualized point-to-point transportation for a whole bunch of other people who, like my husband and I, don't need it every single day for everything we do. The needs that we have for mobility vary significantly in different life cycles, right? We know that parents have much less flexibility in their schedules. They have very high mobility demands, right? So parents live different mobility lives than when they transition out of being parents and before they become parents, right? Something like iGo car sharing, I think probably, in looking at the research, works very well for people who are more like my husband and I and who sort of have this dog that requires acupuncture versus somebody who, is looking at the soccer games, the the taekwondo after school, the multiple trips to multiple middle schools, that kind of life.
Yes, and my wife and myself who are moving beyond the need for the minivan that still sits in our driveway. Are there places that you can point to within this country or anywhere else in the world where you see a model developing that looks like it is an example of what we could achieve?
My theory here is perhaps not as useful to people as it might be, but my suspicion is that so many of our metropolitan forms are idiosyncratic in such a way that what develops essentially is a unique network and set of mobility models or set of modes for each place. So when you actually look at the train networks around the world, they're all unbelievably different. And so for Los Angeles, what concerns me about Los Angeles is I don't think anybody really understands our urban form that well.
Mm-hmm.
We haven't described it all that well. It's a controversial region. It's a city that people either demonize or idealize, And what works in a place like Boston, which built up much earlier, may not be a transferable model for here. And I suspect, I could be wrong about this, but the thing that eventually makes Los Angeles work, right, will be grown organically here and won't look like anything anywhere else.
So London's solution, New York's solution, Boston's solution is probably not directly adaptable to us.
Probably not.
I guess then your proposal of an iGo-like solution might be uniquely suited to Southern California, where we do treasure our cars, and who knows, maybe we'd adapt better to one that isn't entirely ours than to not having one at all?
I think for car subscription services, which have had their own set of troubles getting started in Los Angeles, there's a chicken and egg problem. Cars are durable goods, and a lot of people here already drive and already own cars. And so something like a subscription service is something that you're only likely to subscribe to when you're transitioning out, when you're thinking about getting rid of the vehicle anyway. And so we've had trouble making the business model work here. I think for something like the iGo here, it might be very useful for community organizations, right? Places where we know, communities in Los Angeles where we know there's a great deal of social isolation, right? Where we know there's a lot of transit usage and very long transit trips. That the combination of getting them access to express bus services, light rail, for line haul portions of their trip, and for repetitive trips might be a good combination, along with an iGo-like model for the sorts of local, go into the store, go into the doctor kind of trips that may or may not be well served by public transit.
Let me go back to public transit for a moment. I actually love to take the trains in L.A. I just, in fact, last week made the trip from Long Beach to Pasadena, which requires a trip on 3 different trains.
Yep.
The Blue Line, the one that runs from Long Beach up into downtown downtown L.A. You see lots of different types of people on there, but I would have to say the vast majority look like they are in this group you talk about, which may not have easy access to automobiles. You don't see a lot of people who are obviously from the wealthier parts of Southern California. Is that a handicap for public transit here and elsewhere? Because it's maybe a little bit out of sight, out of mind.
Well, I think there is a component to the out of sight, out of mind portion of what you're saying. I get grouchy and I hear this argument a lot about, well, you won't get white people on the bus.
Mm.
When I read my book, I'm gonna title it something like "White People Need to Get on the Bus."
Get on the bus. I like it.
Because that whole "white people won't get on the bus" justification for building rail hither and yon and everywhere, even in places where it doesn't make sense. To me, it's just like the worst face of urban racism in the United States. What do you mean you're not going to ride a bus? I mean, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. I mean, if you refuse to get on a bus, you're essentially saying that the light rail has to go within a half mile or a quarter mile, worse, of every single person's house. That's just not very likely in a place like Los Angeles. There's nothing wrong with our buses. In Los Angeles, we have problems, and the MTA is aware of these problems, and that's why they're so focused on getting their rail lines built, is it's very hard to operate on-time service when the traffic is as stochastic as it is in Los Angeles. Right? So sometimes on the 2, which operates on Sunset Boulevard, you can just sail down Sunset and the bus is running right on time, and then other parts of the day, it's running terribly cold. You can't predict when the bus gets there. And that's a real discouragement to people actually using the bus. And at that point, bus service does become an inferior good. But I get very impatient with the argument that, well, once we sort of pander to affluent white people in cities enough, they'll eventually get out of their cars and sort of suck it up and go out there and deal with public space. And that means everybody who's out there in public space. No, you get on the bus and see what it's like before you decide that it's a scary place.
Before we leave this area of discussion, we're talking at a time when California is facing some of the biggest, maybe the biggest since the Great Depression, fiscal challenges it has ever faced. I suspect that transportation is one of those sectors, including public transportation, that is going to be very negatively affected by the state and local jurisdictions' lack of funds over the next couple of years. What do we do? I mean, if anything, we're looking probably at bus lines and similar services being cut back.
Probably. There are a couple responses to that. The MTA was able to benefit from the passage of a sales tax last November, but that's not going to be a panacea forever, and everybody in the transportation game knows this. Sales tax revenues are extremely volatile, and for the most part, the vision for those sales tax revenues is capital improvements, not really for operations and stuff like that. The combination I think that we're going to be seeing in the next decade is troublesome for transportation across the board, with the prospect of rising fuel prices, right along with pressures. And those rising fuel prices and rising energy prices are things that transit companies feel as well as consumers do. At the same time, that we also have state budgets that can be described as nothing other than a mishigash. That we're going to probably see reductions in routes, but probably more likely reductions in service hours, because that's where cost savings come relatively quickly. I mean, you can still provide some level of service rather than just eliminating the route. You just eliminate night service. You start to cut back on that. Now, that in and of itself has consequences for job access for all sorts of people, but it does hit people who are impoverished hard. Second and third shift workers depend on night service quite a bit. And so that's part of that conversation about service provision and where we cut back that, is sort of an obvious point for social equity that we know about going forward. In terms of what do we do? Well, one of the things might be to come to some agreement on the budget, which is easier said than done. Prior to a lot of the credit problems, many of the answers were supposed to come from public-private partnerships, but that doesn't seem like it's very likely anymore.
What are the costs, the societal costs, of not dealing with these issues adequately?
What we end up doing, other than, and again I'm going to speak to this from a social justice perspective, we end up making it difficult for us to have access to all levels of human capital. when we make it difficult for people to get around cities. There's a basic humanity component to what we're discussing. So, for example, a cleaning lady who's getting on the Blue Line somewhere in South Central who needs to get over to Beverly Hills or up to Bel Air is facing about a 2-hour transit trip on a bad day. That raises everybody's costs. It raises the costs of employing this person. It raises her costs. It takes time away from her family. These are costs. I don't know that this costs out from an economic perspective or an aggregate perspective, but it does have real consequences in terms of the amount to which the region as a whole functions. Beyond that, when people don't see themselves or when people are not included socially, and it's very hard to get around, the capacity for us to have a regional political conversation about the direction the region should go, I think, starts to suffer. Now, this is a fuzzy-wuzzy political statement, and I don't actually have any empirics to back this up, but regional fragmentation is a real factor in governance. So that it's always the case that Hollywood's interests see themselves differently from the interests of South Central, and we don't have any sort of mobility that ties this whole thing together. It's very easy for us not to think of ourselves as one place.
If you have time, there are a couple of other things I'd like to throw at you, beginning with one that is an area that you've studied, and it's a couple of words that are still fighting words for a lot of people in Southern California, and that's toll roads.
Fighting words. Toll roads. Well, we can talk a lot about toll roads. They're very interesting.
They certainly have popped up here and there, only in the last very few years in Southern California, as solutions to our inability to improve infrastructure through other means. But it does seem like almost by definition they introduce issues of inequity.
Pretty much every public decision that we make has distributional consequences of some sort. So where we decide to build the rail also has consequences for social equity right along with whether or not we decide to put pricing on freeways. So all of that said, you're right. There are differences in out-of-pocket costs for people who are entering the roadway. In general, my critique of what we know about toll roads, even though there's a lot written about it, is that we don't have a very creative way of thinking about what social equity means there. So you could paint this picture a lot of different ways. If it's the case that toll roads require a higher sort of percentage sacrifice from impoverished people in terms of their out-of-pocket costs, as in it costs people who are impoverished relatively more to take a toll road than it does somebody who's affluent. Okay, that's one way of looking at the equity problems here. But Pat Monktarian, who's out of UC Davis, wrote a wonderful paper a few years ago talking about how the defensive measures that people use to combat congestion delays are also unevenly distributed. So, for example, okay, so fine, I'm late coming back from work because I got caught in traffic, but I have a nanny at home, right? This is something that's unevenly distributed as well. And, I have a cell phone. If I'm affluent, lots of people have cell phones. But I may have a gardener who takes care of my lawn so that extra time I waste every week is not a big problem for me. That in and of itself is something that people who don't have as much cash can't substitute around. And so getting places on time may actually be more valuable to them. So that's another way of thinking about, our congestion delays actually might be regressively distributed as well. Those might have a component of social injustice. There's also a geographic component. Because of the way that the Los Angeles region in particular, most regions are like this in some way, but because of Los Angeles and the way that it's set up, if you price some parts of the network, you're going to get different people. So pricing traffic coming in from the valley is different from pricing people who are driving on the 110. And that geographic aspect of it, about there are different drivers on different parts of the system, is also something that we haven't looked at terribly carefully. And then finally, what London did, which I think is a very good strategy, I'm not sure that you can necessarily translate this immediately to Southern California, is that they used the money to turn around and provide a whole lot of substitute transportation modes.
I'm glad you brought this up because I was going to mention, and of course it's been proposed for New York, that the center city simply become a sort of toll zone, and you pay if you drive into it. Is that what you're referring to?
Well, the London toll is a cordon toll. It's not pricing in the way that congestion pricing is. It's a cordon toll. So basically, you drive past a cordon and you pay. It's a flat fee.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they also have a diesel emission zone in London, which is slightly different, in an attempt to try to price high-emitting vehicles out of the center of London. New York's various toll strategies were much more like London's than this notion of what we've done primarily in California, which is high-occupancy toll lanes, right? Lanes that you can opt into if you want to be in free-flowing traffic conditions. So they operate a little bit differently. And in London's case, the strategy was we're going to take people's money if they want to contribute to congestion downtown, but then we're going to turn around and use those revenues to put a lot of buses on the roads as quickly as we can, so that it's possible for people to get around the city without paying the toll. I think that's a lot harder in a place like Los Angeles, but it sort of gets to this idea of we are going to be asking people to sacrifice some of their income. Is there a way that we give them a better choice? Because the governments don't want to be in the position of being a monopoly provider of transportation and giving people no choice but the toll road. That does have equity problems, and it just annoys people beyond that. It's politically very difficult to get done.
Yeah.
But if you can get them express bus services, if you can get them rail in the center line, if you can get them another way to get into work in the morning, so that some days they can take the car when they really, really need the car, and then 3 days out, and then they pay the toll, and then 3 days a week they don't have to pay the toll. It really opens up people's capacity to optimize around the price so that the equity consequences don't have to be as bad as they look when you just pencil them out. The other thing here is that ultimately we're going to get all sort of urban economics on you for a second. There isn't any way to discipline demand on these facilities except by virtue of congestion or pricing. You are either going to have one or the other. So this idea that we can just somehow fix congestion without using prices to discipline demand is a fantasy. You can't build your way out of it. You can also provide extra capacity via rail, but eventually at some population and demand level, both of those will congest, right? Congestion is a reality of urban agglomeration.
So the invisible hand is on the freeway, too.
So the invisible hand is on the freeway, and right now what we have to discipline freeway demand are congestion delays, congestion costs.
Mm-hmm.
And so those are the two choices, is we're either going to have congested facilities or we're going to price them.
Can I throw one more at you? I'm sure you can deal with this in, 30 seconds. How do you feel about the new administration now that we're a little more than 100 days in? How is the Obama administration dealing with or not dealing with transportation infrastructure?
I think we're going to spend a lot of money relatively quickly.
We'll stimulate some conversation here, if nothing else.
Stimulate some conversation. I'm a big Obama fan. I think he's wonderful in many regards, and, I'm a big supporter. I'm a little worried about the comparisons that people make between the Work Progress administration and this new stimulus bill, largely because the WTA was really a lot more focused on hiring individuals.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas with our new focus on shovel-ready projects, our new way of delivering projects means that a lot of that money is going to go to contractors first and workers down the line. And I would be happier, for example, if we were to be thinking about using some of that money to help make the bus stops in Los Angeles wonderful, right? Plant some trees, get benches out there, get shade out there. It'd be a way of employing a lot of construction work quickly, but it's not wrapped up in one big project after another big project. And things like those bus stops really do affect whether people want to use the system or not. It's a useful thing to do. And so I'm torn.
It's still early, right? It has only been a little more than 100 days.
Yes, it is.
But I'm all for some of those WPA public art projects, decorating some of those bus stops and train stations and even the sides of freeways if we're up to it.
Oh, and really making a beautifully designed bus. How fun would that be?
Yeah. Lisa, it has been delightful. Thank you so much for taking a good deal of your time to talk to us today on Transcast.
Great. I had a good time.
Me too. Thanks again. Take care. This has been a Metrans Transcast. Metrans is funded by the United States Department of Transportation and the California Department of Transportation, Caltrans. We hope you'll join us for the next edition of Transcast.